You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Reverend David G. Latimore. He's also a doctor. He's at Princeton Theological Seminary. He's also part of the Betsy Stockton Center for Black Church Studies. So we're going to talk about his work. So Reverend, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your, I don't know if you'd call it a ministry or, as a reverend, your preaching or, what would you call your activities in the church? And then what would you call your activities, I guess, at the university? It sounds like, it's funny, it's like clinical versus research work, I guess, in the medical field, it seems like.
Well, certainly. Again, delighted to be with you today. My journey began, I was born and raised within the African-American religious experience and institutions and grew up in the church. Went to undergraduate and shortly thereafter pursued a career in investment management, served there for approximately 15 years. For the latter half of that period, also served as a bivocational pastor in a small church in the city of St. Louis. And one of the realities of that experience is that the needs of those types of religious communities required more of me than simply intellect. It required training. And so I wound up going and attending seminary to get better trained to lead religious institutions. And subsequent to that time, began a pastorate at a church right outside of the city of Chicago. Was there for about 9 years. And during that time, after having attended seminary, the intellectual bug was ignited within me, and I pursued additional research and study. So wound up getting a doctorate in ministry from McCormick Theological and also a PhD from the University of Chicago, while continuing to serve in the church. And my research was shaped by both my experiences in the church and my experience in investment management. What I wanted to look at was the ways in which economic theory shaped religious institutions and to what consequence, what impact did it have to have churches that are deeply immersed within this economic moment, and how did that affect how they lived out their faith, how they understood their faith, and what they were able to do to the benefit of communities. So for me, research and the life in the church came hand in hand with one another. And I now find myself at a place where I'm able to pull from both my time in the pastorate, my time in the academy as a researcher, and most importantly, my commitment to the well-being and the betterment of the African-American community, which by extension is for the betterment of the totality of the human community. So this is a great place for me to be because it allows me to really tap into the various experiences that I've had.
Yeah, that's interesting. What's involved in being a good and functioning pastor? I have no clue. That's why I'm asking. And then I want to ask you about your research.
Sure. Well, what is essential from a pastoral perspective, particularly if one is serving in a religious institution where the community itself is struggling, there are a couple of requisite talent, skills, or perspectives that one would need. The first of which is the desire to allow one's faith to have a practical impact on the lives of the men and women, both who attend your church, but also who live within the shadows of the church. For me and for the religious institutions I've been part of, the Christian faith requires the ability not simply to engage in ideological or philosophical or intellectual discussions, but to see the places where one's faith really shapes one's praxis. And that's an important element of pastoring. Secondly, you just have to have a love of people. The reality is that men and women come through the doors of the church with all kinds of very complex narratives and historical context and issues that they are grappling with. And an effective pastor needs the ability, him or her needs the ability to be able to meet people where they are and to not necessarily fix every problem, but be willing to stand with them in the moments, both the highs and lows of life. And so that really requires some emotional, spiritual resilience of the individuals who serve in that capacity. And then thirdly, you have to have a vision for the betterment of the community. Why is it that you've been placed in this particular geographic space? And what are the issues that are most impactful to the churches and the community that live within that space? And what role might you play in contributing to the betterment of that community while also gaining from what that community brings to you in your own personal development and growth? So very much a dialectical relationship between the church and the community, where both the pastor, minister, and a congregant and community members all benefit from one another's presence in each of their lives.
So as a pastor, do people come to you, let's say after or before the service with particular problems? Do you ever go to them, or there's plenty of them that come to you periodically? How does it happen?
Great question. Individuals do happen to come before and after moments of worship within a church, but certainly that's not the only, nor is that the most frequent incident. If you are pastoring a church full-time, then odds are your doors are open throughout the course of the week. And individuals tend to come at all available times to come and speak, both in terms of personal challenges that they're facing, but also communal challenges. For about 9 years, I served a church outside of the city of Chicago. It was what we would refer to as a historical African-American church. And it had a reputation in that community of being focused on communal needs. So I would get individuals who would show up at our church throughout the course of the week to raise any number of issues, from the quality of the education in the public school system to issues of environmental discrimination that might have been occurring because a lot of the industrial work for that community was done on the African-American dominated side of the city, from issues of unfair police practices, the political system, and the desire to have adequate representation. I mean, the issues really span the gamut of human existence, and individuals would come at any and all times that the door was open to get input, insight, or partnership in responding to the many needs of that community. So in addition to on Sundays, they would come Monday through Saturdays, or as you're out in the community and engaged, you'd often have these encounters, again, with individuals who may or may not be members of your church, but who are in need of partnership and help. And that's the one thing I would stress. We live at a time when there are so many individuals within our various communities that are struggling simply to have the basic necessities for a full and flourishing life. So a pastor's hand or a member within a social service organization is going to have their hands full, simply responding to the multitude of needs that come across the threshold of our office or into which we walk as we participate in the lives of others.
Yeah, I have a friend who works on computers, and everyone thinks he knows everything about computers. And, but it sounds like with you, people come to you literally for everything under the sun. I mean, how could you possibly address it all? It's like they want you to solve cancer and world hunger and just every problem that, plagues them. It seems like they come to you with everything.
You're absolutely right that individuals often there's a wide variety of issues that you're confronted with in the life of the church, from individuals who are seeking some relief, we're seeking some progress on issues or some advancement. You'll get a number of issues. I think one of the things that is important to always keep in mind for someone serving that capacity is to have a measure of grace for yourself. You're absolutely right. There are going to be many issues that are going to be presented to a pastor that an individual just can't respond to, that doesn't have the requisite knowledge or the requisite agency or impact needed to fix every problem. And so to realize that your job may not always be to solve an issue, but may well be to bring this issue to the attention of those who are able to solve it, to help the individual that's coming to you to realize their own agency in being able to address some of the issues in their life, to, given the nature of your institution, to be comfortable bringing in the concept that there is a divine being that is also intimately involved in these issues and capable of responding to the needs of people. So one of the things that you early on, if you're going to be successful in pastoring, is to recognize the finitude of your own agency and ability, and to have a comfort level bringing others, encouraging the individual presenting the issue for you, or relying upon the richness of your theological beliefs to fuel your responses, to seek good partnerships with public service or public service organizations, social service organizations, political organizations, other ministries and churches, that it really requires a combined effort to begin to address many of the ills that are confronting the men and women that live within the community of surrounding your church, or surrounding or within the membership of your church.
Do a lot of people come to you wanting answers, or do people come to you just wanting you to listen? I get myself in trouble at home with my wife on that, that dialectic. That's why I asked.
So individuals are often, it is not an uncommon experience for individuals to come to you seeking an answer. But a wise leader of ministries quickly realizes that the most valuable thing that you can often do is just to provide a space for listening and affirmation. A lot of times people present you with personal issues for which they already have the answer, but they need a place to work through that conversation and get to a point where they feel empowered to act upon the answer that might already be at their disposal. In other places, individuals come with issues, and again, there may not be an answer that you have. If someone comes and they recognize that there is a disparity in the resources that are allocated to the public school system in your community, tied to the residential base or tied to past issues of discrimination or the residential composition of your neighborhood, well, there might be a lot that has created the problem that's in front of you, and what's created the problem may not be easily teased out or easily addressed. Your challenge is then again to provide a place of listening, to affirm the individual's instinct towards seeking better solution, and maybe to facilitate conversations across organizations or sectors to begin making incremental progress, and to be mindful that problems generally within a community don't arise overnight. They're not going to be resolved overnight. So they have the patient persistence to pursue a better community for all inhabitants, and that may or may not. Some answers you're going to stumble upon. Some things are going to resolve themselves quickly. Some places the injustice is evident and the remedy to that injustice is clear. But there are going to be other places where the problem is complex, the answer is not clear, and you have to have the willingness, in partnership with your community and the other institutional players within that particular geography, to work toward a better community, even if it's inch by inch, day by day, and step by step.
So what are some of either the most interesting or difficult, or I don't know, challenges that have been put before you by someone in the church that you want, any good examples that you want to talk about?
Sure. One that comes immediately to mind, I had a mother come into to my office. Her son had been pulled over by the police and was subsequently arrested. The car was towed. When the mother went down the very next day to secure the ride, because it was her car, she had already incurred a fine that was in excess of $500. She didn't have those resources. And with each day that car was in that lot, the fine on the car rose exponentially. So the most immediate problem is, how do we get this mother access to her car, because she needs it for the purposes of getting to work? Well, that part of this was really easy to respond to. The church was able to, in that circumstance, provide the resources for the woman to quickly get her car out. But the second issue, which was a lot more complicated, was how were the policing practices in the city being driven simply by the generation of revenue? And to what extent was there practices in place by these tow companies that disadvantaged poor people within this community, and what could be done? And that led us on a long conversation where we pulled data on traffic stops and begin to investigate under what circumstances were cars being towed, to look at the companies that were participating in that program, along with, in partnership with the police department, and began to draw attention to what quickly became apparent were some unfair practices that, again, were focused more on revenue generation than necessarily the creation of safe spaces in our streets. Now, that was the kind of problem that required a lot of research. That was a kind of problem that touched upon a number of issues, both the economic activities within our community, the police treatment or engagement with the poor, practices around traffic stops, et cetera. And I don't know that we solved all of those issues, but we were able to make progress in beginning to have the kind of communal conversation that raised this issue to the attention of not just those who were impacted, but all the members of our community, and to push for changes that were deemed more appropriate and fair for members of our community, regardless of their economic position. So here was a case where it started off just one mother coming in about a particular issue, but quickly expanded and spiraled to be a communal issue for which the church was one of the leading voices. In partnership again with some good folk in the leadership of the police department, some good men and women who served in the public sector, on the city council, et cetera, and members of our community that all came together to raise this injustice to the attention of the community and begin to advocate for a solution.
So when multiple people respond to an incident like this, do you see that it gets a lot of attention, or the church itself, does it command a level of respect in the community? And because the church is involved, people get better outcomes because of its involvement, or what's your thought?
Well, I think it can vary significantly. I was fortunate that, again, our church was a leading church in that community. We were known for advocating on behalf of the well-being of members of our community. I followed a pastor who had been there for 40 plus years and really was one of these folk who came right out of central casting for an African-American pastor. He was there in the 60s and 70s. He was on the front line of advocating change, whether it was getting the school systems integrated, whether it was getting African-American employees at the post office, et cetera. I mean, he had fought a number of communal issues. So our church had a reputation of being a very communally focused institution. And because of both our size and our place, when we drew our attention onto issues, it got amplified. We had great partnerships with many of the public servants in the city government. And so when we raised issues, it brought attention. But equally important was that this was an issue where men and women, both members of our congregation and also outside of our congregation, all rallied together. And when you've got that kind of communal support focused on an issue, while the church can be influential, the church is not the only influence on whether or not these issues get attention. It's when a community becomes focused on an issue and raises their collective voice for the betterment of their fellow members in that community. So we had a couple of different issues: the reputation of the church, the ability of the church to be a catalyst for action on an issue, but also an issue that really captured the attention of men and women in that community, many of whom were not members of our church, but nonetheless recognized that here is a problem that can be solved. And so I would argue any issue can get resolved, can have progress made when the individuals within a community come together to raise issues to the attention of those who have power and to demand solutions that impact the lives of their fellow members within their community.
Have you learned, I guess over time, you and the church would have learned better strategies to handle these kinds of issues? Or are there ones that, seem to come up over and over and over that, some of, I guess they wouldn't make you smile if they were bad issues, but are there issues that just seem to come up over and over and over and never be solved? But, you and, let's say, the church have found automated or better ways to solve them?
Well, I think I would offer the following. So there are issues which seem to be perennial, that constantly surface, and they may change how they're manifested, but at the heart of it, it remains the same issue. So as an example, in the city that I'm thinking of, the lack of economic opportunity, the disparity in wages, the influence of a small universe of individuals who had either because they own businesses, because of their own personal wealth could influence actions and activities within that community. That was a constant issue. So whether there is economic development that is occurring in the neighborhood, but the residents of the neighborhood are not being able to participate in it, whether it is city contracts that were not distributed with any sense of equity or fairness to minority-owned, women-owned businesses in that community. These are all issues that at the heart of them are driven by a particular economic system and a set of values that are informed by those economic realities, but that don't value the life of the men and women who are without economic power, but nonetheless whose lives are incredibly valuable. So for me, I was constantly coming into issues that at the heart of them was this economic framework that gave no regard to the well-being of the men and women who lived around the neighborhood of our church, who were impoverished, who did not have the same economic agency or at least the economic resources as decision makers. And I don't know that we came to any, solutions that were automatic in their result. There were times when issues came up and we had some success. There were times when issues came up and we were frustrated in our progress. And so what we learned is one of the key determinants of, or one of the key criteria for any institution, but particularly the church, is that one must simply be persistent. One cannot give up hope. One cannot allow the seeming lack of progress to thwart one's engagement and one's commitment to seeing progress. So one of the great things about the church is that the church always has a vision of a future community where the ills and the concerns that are most present may see resolution. And it is because of that commitment or that belief in the beloved community, that belief in a community where every life is valued and everyone has what they need for human flourishing. Because of that picture, it gives the church hope when the present reality does not live up to that expectation. So the ability to just keep getting up and keep going at it is one of the unique attributes of religious organizations. And it is what we contribute to the moment to really keep members of our community equally engaged, equally committed, and continuing to work for a better community. So we've, if nothing else, we've certainly learned that it takes a vision of what can be to keep pushing at what seems to refuse to relent in this current moment.
Do people come to you that are not part of the congregation, and does it matter? Do they have to be sponsored or come in with someone that's in the congregation to get help or attention, or how does it work?
Yeah, not at all. Not at all. So the church exists for the betterment of its community and should not hold as a litmus test one's connection to the church to determine the church's involvement in the issues that are presented. Now, having said that, so certainly members of a congregation are more aware of what the church is able to do, and that awareness can create an openness toward those members coming to the church to ask for assistance, whereas members of the community simply may not know as well what the church can and will and might do. So I think the numbers of individuals who are seeking help from outside of the church can vary significantly. But the church's posture ought to be, we are in a community to fight for the well-being of the entire community and to not make that help contingent just on membership. So to have a different sense of who is important to the church, it is everyone who is important to the God served by the church. And to have a notion of God does not limit God's engagement simply based on a person's organizational connection to a religious community.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, and that's good to know. Yeah. Are there other churches that your church interacts with in the local area? Do they operate independently, or do they sometimes, multiple congregations will come together on a given problem?
Yes, so I was a pastor of a Baptist church. And so as a part of that religious tradition, those churches are what we refer to as congregational. So there is a broader overreaching relationship with other Baptist churches, but each church exercises a measure of autonomy. And there are other churches of other traditions that may have a more tightly woven network with other churches. But having said that, The autonomy of our ministry allowed us to reach beyond denominational barriers, to engage in partnership with other churches around issues of shared importance to multiple congregations. I will say that we still live in a world where race and economics still has an impact on these opportunities for collective engagement and collaboration across churches. We still live in a world where race colors how we see problems and how we respond to problems. Class and economics colors what's important to us as potential problems and what are the solutions to the problems that presented themselves. So there's a lot that is ingrained in the very culture in which we exist that frustrates collaboration and partnership or prohibits partnership having a substantive impact on the community. You can find lots of examples of partnerships between churches where there's no practical or substantive outcome. But finding those partnerships where there is a commitment to systemic change or can be harder to find. And that's the result, in part at least, because of the issues of race and class that continue to exert influence on how we see ourselves and how we see potential partners.
Would you mind if we switch to talk about your research? Because I thought that was interesting.
Sure.
So, the economics and how it affects a church. So is it that some churches are better at, receiving tithing and therefore they, the more money the church has, the better it does? Or like, what's the relationship there that you discovered?
Sure. So I would probably start even more simply than that. So each of us are immersed in an economic system that makes a variety of assumptions that often go unquestioned by the individuals in that system. So as a good example, if you were to ask someone, what does it mean for you to be free? Odds are the question of freedom may not occur to the individual as first and foremost an economic issue, but it is certainly deeply informed by the economic system that we're in, because our economic system tells us that part of being free is the ability to choose what fulfills the individual's desire, to be able to pursue the satisfaction of that desire, limited only by the resources that the individual has, and by some broad boundary of not doing harm to others. That's what our economic system teaches us about freedom. Our economic system suggests to us that we ought to be ahistorical. And by ahistorical, I mean that our attention ought to be riveted to this current moment and that we pay less attention to how we arrived at this moment. Our economic system teaches us that we ought to be asocial, meaning that I ought to be free to make decisions for my life without regard necessarily to the well-being of the lives of others. And you see these notions at play all throughout our current culture, whether you're talking about whether an individual ought to be vaccinated, whether they ought to wear a mask, how workers are treated, what's fair expectations for our workers in this time where people are debating whether or not the unemployment benefits actually incentivize individuals not to work. Like, at the heart of these are questions around what does it mean for me to be autonomous? What does freedom look like for us? And what pursuits should I be engaged in to lead a flourishing and impactful life? Well, if that's the conversation that's happening at the individual level, that conversation is also happening at the institutional level. So often churches, again, because they're not thinking in terms of the explicit influence of the economic system, they're making decisions that oftentimes only reflect economic presuppositions. So as an example, one might ask a church, what does it mean for you to be successful? And how do you envision your success? And are the measures or criteria for success reducible to just a set of quantitative characteristics? Am I more successful if I have more folks on the pews? Am I more successful if I raise more revenue, have more services? And to what degree are those criteria, if those are the ones that an individual chooses to measure one's church by, are those criteria themselves informed by an economic system that is quick to commodify life, quick to quantify the measures of success and to incentivize leaders of all kinds of organizations to do the things that will allow an institution to experience those quantifiable measures of success. Part of what, and I'm coming out of the Christian tradition, but I think this is shared across several of the religious traditions, is that there are ways of understanding what it means to be successful that don't follow the models offered to us by our economic system. There are ways of having an identity of who you are as an individual and what does freedom really mean that does not disregard your freedom as it is experienced by the other, that incentivizes us to pursue avenues that foster community in ways that our economic system does not do. So part of my research is to say, hey, where are there, or how might we measure examples of the influence of economic ideology on shaping how the church understands its identity, how it articulates Christian identity for its congregants, and what kinds of praxis does the church or the individual pursue as a result of their faith, when their faith is not simply a rearticulation of economic theory. I would argue that much of what we see in religion today is no more than neoliberalism, kind of, put in a different package, but it's not theology, it's economic systems that are now being presented as though they are theologically sound insights on what it means to be human and what it means to be free and what it means to experience liberation and what ought to be the telos or the end goal for the actions of the church. So that's where my research rests.
Yeah, because they could see, right? One church could say, well, we have 1,000 people on average come for service on Sunday, so therefore we're successful. And another one could say, we've been able to step in and solve most major issues that our congregants have come to us the past month. So that's success. Or I guess there's many different ways you could define it. What are some ways that you've found that really truly reflect success and the people in the church feel good about the type of success they have? And okay, this is the right kind of success that we're looking for versus wrong.
Well, as you, it probably won't come as no surprise to you. My response to that question begins within the biblical canon itself. I think that, and again, I'm out of the Christian tradition, I think that Christianity offers us some resources to help us understand success. And one of the examples I would quickly point to is the Lazarus story. And for those who may not be familiar with it, Lazarus is a friend of Jesus. Lazarus succumbs to an illness. Lazarus is buried. Jesus shows up late. Lazarus' family is a little bit upset with Jesus for not getting there sooner. Jesus calls Lazarus from the tomb and Lazarus is resurrected. And interestingly, in that story, Jesus does not complete the miracle, but he turns to the crowd and tells them to loose Lazarus, who has come out of the tomb still wrapped in his grave clothes. Jesus tells the community to loose him and to let him go. And one of the great things about that story is that it envisions the work of the community as participating in the liberation of the one who has been brought back to life. And so the church can think about its own goals in terms of not how does benefit accrue to our institution, but how can we be a part of or participate in the elevation of the needs of the other, the liberation of those who are struggling in this moment. And if we put those needs first, how does that shift the work that we do or the expectations that we have of ourselves? Now, I would go a step further to suggest that this is not just an act of benevolence. So this is not just those who have resources simply providing those resources or that help because that is the charitable thing to do. I would argue that the crowd that's gathered around Lazarus, as they participate in removing what binds Lazarus, they have an opportunity to better understand their own liberty. And in like manner, the church that engages in focusing first on the well-being of those who are in some form of bondage or oppression within a community, as a church focuses on their needs, it is not only to the benefit of those individuals, but the church and congregants benefit because they have the opportunity to experience greater levels of their own agency and their own liberty. And that's what's missing, I think, oftentimes in the economic solutions that are provided to us. It suggests that the satisfaction of your desires is the key toward happiness, when in fact, your happiness might be far more contingent upon the well-being of others than you might imagine. So not only doing good for good's sake, but doing good because it benefits you in the acts of working for the betterment of others. And so that's just a different way of thinking about what is the work that religious institutions are called to, and how one begins to experience greater measures of their own human flourishing and their own human agency, to cast it outside of their desires being the predominant or primary catalyst or lens through which one understands their success, but rather recognizing that these religious institutions, and I would argue even beyond the religious institutions, these individuals are called to facilitate the well-being of others, and in doing so, to experience their own flourishing more fully and more completely.
Well, I figure within a given church, the pastor can't do everything. So there are positions that people, show that they want to do, and then they assist the pastor. Or what's the structure of a well-run church that, is able to help a lot?
A great question. And again, I would borrow from the model that I've just suggested. So the model of the pastor as the sole provider of services to a community is often driven by one of two things: either a congregation that views the pastor as a hired hand, and that their own identity, religious identity, is not contingent upon their own engagement or issues, or at times it is the result of the pastor, who envisions that their value is found in their instrumental engagement in the problems that are presented to them. But a different way of thinking about this is for a pastor to recognize that the way in which I experience my greatest success is by meeting the need of my congregants to be engaged in the work of discipleship in intimate and practical ways. And that very mindset will cause a pastor to look out and to see, how can I orchestrate not moments of me responding to issues alone, but me creating the opportunities for the people on the pews to get engaged in the bringing about of this community and its well-being to be realized in greater and increasing degrees. So the difference in those mindsets will result in a leader within a church constantly looking to do exactly what we see Jesus do in that Lazarus text, to get the crowd involved, to not believe there is a role for Jesus to play in this text. There's a role for a pastor to play within an organization, but to recognize that pastor or that ecclesial leader is not the end of the story, but rather the facilitator of getting others involved, and getting others involved in ways big and small, but nonetheless realizing that that's essential to the individuals within a church realizing their own fuller picture of their Christian identity and flourishing as a part of the human community. And you probably have had this experience as well, that you've gone to do something for someone else and wind up really being blessed by that engagement in ways that you didn't imagine. Standing by a bedside of someone who's ill and just in being present with them can leave the individual with the kinds of experiences that enrich their lives in ways that they could not imagine. Going to a senior home and just engaged in activities with the residents of that community. Yes, you are doing some good, but oftentimes the individual is transformed more than the people that they're engaging. So this notion of there is something to be experienced through service of others that is essential to Christian identity. A good pastor understands that and is constantly trying to facilitate those moments so that congregants can really begin to have a taste of, this is what the human community is designed to be. Here's how I flourish as a member of that community by taking the focus off myself and looking to be instrumentally used for the well-being of others.
Well, last question, because I know we're running out of time.
Sure.
What's the most amazing example of a well-run church that you've seen? And, what did they do? Like, is there an example that jumped out at you and you're like, wow, this is really what it's supposed to be?
So there are a variety of, I think, good examples of these kind of churches within the African-American community. One that immediately comes to mind is Trinity Church in Chicago that has had an historic commitment to the well-being of the congregants on that side of the city of Chicago. And certainly Chicago has the full plethora of social challenges for their community, whether it is issues of poverty, whether it's issues of drug abuse, whether it's issues of policing, et cetera. And Trinity has been constantly committed to this notion of being used not simply for its own aggrandizement, but for the benefit of the community members that exist around the church. So they come to mind. Alfred Street down in Virginia is another church that has, again, had a long and historic commitment to the well-being of its community. And, again, these are churches that are larger in terms of their resources and the individuals that attend. And one might be led to believe that they're better because they're larger. But I would argue that they are larger because they focus on something other than themselves, and people were drawn to that. So those are two ministries that come immediately to mind. Allen Temple, that is in the New York area, is another great example. So there are plenty of examples. The challenge, however, is for every Trinity, there are probably 5 to 10 churches that also are equal of size, but have achieved that through a really insular focus on simply growing themselves to the benefit of themselves. And they've not had the kind of requisite communal impact. One within the African-American community, one ought to argue, hey, we've got churches on every corner, and yet the social ills in African-American communities remain. Why is that? Well, that's because even though we have churches on every corner, not every church is engaged in the work of the betterment of its community. So helping churches to find their identity in the engagement of these social issues is at the heart of some of the research that I'm engaged in, and I think essential to the well-being and the advancement of the African-American community.
Well, very good. David, thank you for coming on and sharing these stories. It's really fascinating to me. So I really appreciate you being here. Thank you very much. And where can people find out more about your work? Where can they go?
Yeah, well, you can go to the Princeton Theological Seminary website, where we have all of the various centers that exist here at the seminary, one of which is the Betsy Stockton Center for Black Church Studies, which I serve as director of. And it is a great place to begin to see some of the research that we're now engaged in around this very issue. So again, Princeton Theological Seminary, Betsy Stockton Center for Black Church Studies is where I would direct your listeners.
Very good. Again, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you for having me. And I appreciate the time with you today.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.